For this paper, I chose to talk about generation gaps, and I specifically wanted to address the question about whether or not generation gaps can be bridged. So before I start, I want to talk about my sources. I used the book Culture and Commitment, A Study of the Generation Gap by Margaret Mead, psychology.iresearchnet.com, genhq.com, forbes.com, and anthrosource.onlinelibrary.wiley.com. So I want to start off by talking about what a generation is. Naming generations is a relatively new practice. This isn't something that we've been doing for hundreds of years. A generation is defined as a group of people that are born around the same time who are raised in about the same place. These are also called birth cohorts, which are generally 10 to 20 years in length, and they are defined by the sharing of unique experiences. So the oldest generation is known as the silent generation. These members were born in 1945 or before. And then we have the baby boomer generation, members born between 1946 and 1964. Then we have Gen X, members being born between 1965 and 1976. And we note that this is a significantly smaller generation than the other ones. This one's only 11 years, while our others, excluding Gen X, are about 18 years. Then we have the millennials, who were born between 1977 and 1995. And finally, we have Generation Z, our current generation, the members born in 1996 to a yet-to-be-determined date. We note that these are generations that are only applicable to North America. Because of these shared unique experiences, generations are based widely on economics, parenting, and technology. All of these things are going to vary widely by culture, which will affect the generations. So now, what is a generation gap? The term generation gap was coined by a famous anthropologist known as Margaret Mead. She wrote the book Culture and Commitment, A Study of the Generation Gap, and she defined a generation gap as the difference in values, attitudes, or behaviors between older and younger generations. So a widely used example to demonstrate the differences in generations is the effect of 9/11, the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. This event heavily affected the millennial generation because this is a unique experience that we shared during our development. However, Generation Z is not as impacted by it because this is just a page in the history book to them, to those born in 1996 and later, or 1997 and later. So I wanted to do interviews to get a grasp on what the differences are between generations. So I selected several family and friends with differing backgrounds and differing political beliefs from the millennial and boomer generations. And I came up with 3 questions. So the first question I asked them is, what values do you hold closest to you? And I received a lot of replies to this one. The millennial generation gave me the following values of honesty and work ethic, compassion, justice, equality, honesty again, and kindness. And from the baby boomer generation, I got integrity and honesty. I got this answer twice, family and morality. Next, I asked, what do you think are the most pressing issues we face today? I asked this in a political sense and not on a personal level. I wanted to see the differences in political opinions across the generations. The millennial generation gave me the following: human rights violations and hatred of our fellow human at the border, along with climate change that is killing our planet and children, as well as our general safety in terms of the dangers that Black people, Hispanics, Muslim, LGBTQ, women, etc. face. And from the boomer generation, I got political and civil unity for the good of our country, and dealing with the homeless population, the high price of prescription drugs, and how to deal with persons who commit crimes. Lastly, I straight up asked each person, what do you think of the older or younger generation, depending on which group I was asking. This I got much more honest. This way I got a much more honest depiction of what each group thought of the other. So the millennials said, the older generation is generally mindful of others, but ours is willing to sacrifice more for the greater good of others. I mean this in terms of paying taxes to improve healthcare, passing gun reform laws for a safer world, etc. Older generations have an I worked for it, so why shouldn't they attitude when their world was drastically different than ours is. And I'd say I value experiences more than material ownership, and I value everyone being able to afford health, happiness, and advantage. Marry who you love, equal education for all, and social welfare. As compared to boomers' answers of, in terms of work, I found that my older workers have a strong work ethic and strong morals, while the younger people I hire have to be worked with more and can act a little entitled. I got several answers. They all revolved around entitlement and work ethic. So a little interpretation where I just go over the differences in the answers. The first two questions didn't have huge differences. In the first question, I think the difference in the values is seen in that millennials give values that tend to lean toward character traits that make you a better person towards other people, like kindness and compassion. Whereas the boomer answers were focused on, honesty, integrity, which, encompass being a good person, but it's not a part of the entire picture. The same goes for the answer about the pressing issues. These weren't as different. There was just a small difference I noticed, that millennials seemed to point out issues facing marginalized groups more than the boomers did. But both answers really focused on the important issue of how we treat others in our society. Lastly, this one was a lot more telling. It was more straightforward. Millennials showed a very distinct reaction that they think the older generations don't believe that everyone should have an equal experience on this earth, and tend to have a bit of a short-sighted view of the world, while boomers seem to think younger generations entitled, and they don't have a strong work ethic like their generation did. They had to work hard to get to where they are, and millennials don't understand that. So I thought these answers were all very telling and interesting. There seems to be an experience that boomers went through that millennials can't quite grasp, and likewise an experience that millennials went through that boomers can't quite relate to. So the answers given were generally not drastically different, but both generations clearly have strong opinions on the other. So this begs the question, can the generation gap be bridged? And to give a very broad answer, I don't think it can ever be entirely bridged, just because of the unique experiences that each generation faces that cannot be fully understood by the other. Tension between generations has never been a new thing. Baby boomers have faced it. Gen Xers have faced it. They went through their share of scorn for their idealism and their lack of loyalty, specifically in the 70s. So this is kind of just a pattern repeating itself. Now the millennials are under fire. I wanted to share a quote from Margaret Mead, which I think rings true. On page 88, it will be the child and not the parent and grandparent that represents what is to come. And on page 94, out of their new knowledge, new to the world and new to us, must come the questions to those already equipped by education and experience to search for answers. This is to mean that the older generations can learn from and collaborate with the younger generations in finding answers to the problems we face. And I think that's a huge key in beginning to bridge any gap is collaboration. Communication is also very important. Communication between generations should be encouraged. Each generation should take the time to learn new things. Don't be hesitant to learn these new things because of the back in my day attitude or the this isn't relevant to me anymore attitude. Take interest in what's happening in the lives of others, regardless of their age. Listen when someone older is sharing experiences. Listen when someone younger is shouting for change. And more than anything, lead by example. The famous quote goes, "Be the change you wish to see," and that rings very true in this situation. So there really is no hard and fast answer to this, unfortunately. Whether or not this can happen depends on millions of individuals, and having 100% in that situation is not realistic. But I think that enough change can happen to make a difference in how we treat each other and how we view each other and the different generations. And at some point, we can become a population that is able to mostly work together enough to overcome hurdles and live in a more understanding and peaceful world.